Hey guys, welcome to the Dreadcutter podcast.
If you want to know how to blast your opponent down to zero authority, come check us out.
Woo! Woo!
We're going to talk about valuing scrap. And so, in terms of valuing scrap, that's one of my favorite strategies because who doesn't want a more efficient deck, right? Basically, when you are able, now it does take a little time, but it's definitely a strategy at the beginning of the game that you want to worth pursuing if it's available to you. And it might take a little time, but the thing is, more times than not, I don't know how many times where it's just that person has that slightly more efficient deck that beats me more times than not. So what do you have to say about that, Ryan? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Your starter cards, they're starters for a reason. You know, they only do one thing. They deal one damage or give you one trade. And very quickly, you'll find that the cards that you're buying are actually better than those cards. So by buying scrap cards, it allows you to get rid of your scouts and your vipers and allows you to draw into your other cards much more quickly, much more effectively. So your deck goes from having 8 scouts, 2 vipers to, having blob alphas.
Well, 0, yeah.
Yeah. And that's really what you want, is to be able to do effective damage turns over and over and over again. And scrapping allows you to do that.
Yeah, and the thing is, a lot of times when you begin the game, it's almost like scrap wars, right? Because if a person starts getting lots of scrappers in their deck, and this is more of an intermediate thing, then you want to take a look at that because it's going to change the way that you play. You have to actually kill your opponent before there's another clock that gets set in your head. When an opponent gets scrappers, that you have to actually beat this opponent, or else they will be more efficient than your deck.
One thing that happens when you buy a scrapper is, you notice we've talked a little bit about how scrapping can be slow, which sounds weird. I'm sure that there were some comments where people were like, I don't understand. I thought scrapping makes your deck fast. Scrapping makes your deck efficient, which means you're going to be drawing into your better cards more often because you've gotten rid of your weaker cards. But here's the thing. When you buy a scrapper and you put it into your deck, unless it has a card draw already on it, it's another card that's taking up a slot, that's taking up a draw in your deck, right? Yeah, exactly. As good as these cards are, they're what's called weighted. They don't draw. They require you to draw them in your hand. They become part of your initial 5 cards that you draw. So yes, eventually, so you draw a scrapper first, right? You buy the scrapper, you put it in your deck. So let's say this is all you bought. You started out with 10 cards, 8 scouts, 2 vipers. You bought a probe bot. Now you have 11 cards in your deck. None of them draw each other, so it takes 11 draws to get through your deck. Then you play probe bot, you scrap a scout. Now you're back down to 10. So now your deck has the same amount of draws as it did when you first started the game. Then you draw the probe bot again. Now your deck is more efficient. Now you have 9 cards instead of 10. Now your deck is more efficient. So it actually takes 2 cycles through your deck in order to make your scrap cards more efficient than when you put them into your deck.
Yeah, and so that's what you have to take into account when you first look at your opponent, you versus your opponent's deck. Is I'm actually making an investment that may or may not pay off over time. When I put 2 or 3 scrap cards in my deck, that means I'm making a sacrifice. I'm betting that my opponent is not going to beat me before a set number of turns, that I can actually be more efficient than them. That's why we really encourage, if you're going to scrap early, scrap as early as you can, because if you start scrapping mid-game, then you're actually doing yourself a disadvantage, And the thing is, when we first started scrapping, we just kept on, picking up red cards, and we were like, yeah, this is great, and this is cool, but we never knew why, until years of playing. We were just
we just realized we're winning a lot more when we buy red cards. It's so strange.
We just didn't know what it was doing, but now that we've advanced in our Star Realmsy knowledge, of the mechanics of the game and the science behind the science,
the science behind the science.
we could
more important than the actual science.
If this was if you had what is it, what are those curves called? I'll just call it on the Cartesian plane, right? You have the
Sure. I know what you're talking about.
If we have two lines, right, and
Uh-huh.
one is your opponent's deck and one is my deck, right? Your opponent's deck, if he has no scrap, he might actually get more bloated over time, right? I mean,
His deck gets heavier.
he kind of gets a gradual. Like what you're actually doing when you're scrapping is actually you're bloating your deck earlier, So you're actually hoping that your deck gets more efficient before your opponent can kill you, basically. So I can make a chart on that. It's just like
let's go to the chart.
But you get what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
No,
Early
you're
on-
absolutely right. So like if both of you start at the same level of efficiency, right? 10 cards to 10 cards.
10 cards to 10
And
cards.
then you add 2 scrappers. Well, your deck becomes heavier. You now have 12 cards to your opponent's 10. You bloat your deck initially, but then later on, your deck is going to become more and more efficient, right?
Yeah,
And
it'll
hopefully
stay
your
at the level of your
sort of-
opponent and then go past it,
Yeah. So if this is sort of a line that you're both on, right? Your deck becomes more bloated initially, but then eventually you become more efficient later on, and then this is where you kill your opponent.
Yeah,
His deck has
basically-
remained level, whereas your deck
Sideways.
becomes bloated initially and then goes underneath.
It's a sine wave, basically.
Sideways.
I
I also know what that is. I'm leaving all the math stuff to you, dude.
I'm just saying.
Sideways, Cartesian, tangent, asymptotal, thingamabop. And I'm like, I know all those words. Yeah, no, those are real words in English that I know about. You're trading initial inefficiency to eventually get extra efficiency later on.
It's kind of like habits, like you want to have that, that bag of Cheetos right away because it feels good, right? But then like if you want like a more substantial snack, like, whole plate of like, just nice like Mediterranean hummus and like carrots and something, you have to like go out and buy it.
Kale or whatever.
Or whatever like the more like effective snack is, right?
Yeah.
Now it's gonna feel good at first, but the more you eat like Cheetos, like it bloats you, it makes you feel like ugh, like not good. But when you have that like healthy food, basically that's going to make you just more efficient and
It makes
energetic.
your body more
It
efficient.
gives you a long-term health effect,
Yeah,
So
it's
the
a
same-
long-term benefit versus a short-term benefit.
So it's a long-term versus short-term, whereas like when you buy scrap initially, you're actually investing in your long-term game. And when you buy like little dinky 1s and 2s that don't scrap, it's like you're just bloating your deck over time. But it feels good because you're going to get that damage and that, those effects right away,
Yeah, and this is why I keep saying they should sell kale at 7-Eleven because then everybody would be healthy, but they don't.
Yeah, exactly.
If I could go down the street, if I could like walk half a block and pick up a massive thing of kale and make a kale salad, I would do that. But I can't do that because I have to go to fucking Whole Foods to do that.
Yeah.
But I can go down the street and get Cheetos, no problem. And Cheetos are kind of like that 1 or 2 cost
That's
card
it.
that just sits in your deck and, doesn't really do anything.
It's good like at first.
It's good
Yeah.
first, yeah.
Good
And
first.
then, you get that initial burst of energy, which feels nice. You're like, ooh, I just had food. I've got fuel now. But if you don't do anything with it, then it just weighs you down.
But sometimes that's all
now-
you need for that moment, but like, but like if you're looking at your long-term health or like for people playing a long-term game with Star Realms, like you want to have those kale chips. You want to have those things that get your deck to be the most healthy,
Yeah. And scrapping allows you to do that.
And
So
scrapping-
the other thing I would say is also to value just damage cards. I think a lot of people, they go into a Star Realms game with a mindset of, I'm going to build the coolest deck. I'm going to have all these neat bases, and I'm going to have all this healing and trade, and then I'm going to have this, and that, and it's going to be cool.
Yeah.
When in reality, the main goal of the game is kill your opponent. So, most of the time just going aggro and attacking your opponent, that's how you win. So a lot of times if I see like a couple of trade cards on the trade row, but there's no other like large 8-cost card I'm trying to go after, most of the time I'm just not even going to buy trade at all. I'll just buy damage cards. I'll, buy the dukes and just go after people. Getting those burrowers, 5 damage, draw a card. Getting those swarmers, 3 damage, scrap a card in the trade
Or the
row,
war
combos
kite.
for 5. The war kites, the ravagers. Ooh,
Oh,
I know
that's
they're all
my
blob cards.
favorite. Oh, that's my fave.
Ravager's Bay. Oh, Ravager's Bay. So good. You know, even a card like a Patrol Bot, right? Like it's 4 damage, potentially is a scrap. Like Convoy Bot. Oh, Convoy Bot might be the best 3-drop in the game. Maybe. 4 damage, allies for 2, scraps, hand and discard pile. Makes your deck efficient and does damage. Does a poop load of damage. It's also why I think a card like Cargo Mech is actually overvalued. Because it gives you scrap, yes. It gives you 4 trade, awesome. But very quickly, this card becomes just dead weight in your deck. Yeah, it destroys a target base, but if your opponent has no bases at that turn, then all you're doing is you're getting trade, and that's it. And who cares? And once your deck gets scrapped down, you don't even need it. So this card actually becomes a candidate for scrapping later on, meaning I'll use a scrapper to get rid of this card. You know? So cards that combine some level of efficiency with damage are typically really good. Damage and card draw. Damage and scrap. Damage and trade row protection. Damage and force your opponent to discard cards. Damage and healing. You know, these are typically the best cards because it allows you to get ahead on several different vectors in order to win the game.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree for the most part with that. You know, I mean, there's definitely, like, going back to the cargo met, there's definitely situations in which you actually want the cargo met because say there might be like 3 or 4 like 7, 8 drops that you can just top deck or put in your hand. Then it becomes a influential card, like especially if two people are neck and neck and you just need a couple of things to really swing your hand. Like that card could really come into play. You know, and also cards like Construction Hauler, you know, which allows you to just put a base right in your hand. Like those kinds of cards like that allow you to just get those at the most crucial time, you know, when you need them. So like, yeah, lots of it is, but I would agree for the most part, if we were playing a game, like I would definitely value like lots of cards that can do scrap and damage, because the one thing about a scrapper deck is in order for it to eliminate the residual effect of it being bloated is that you have a lot of damage that can actually help you pace your opponent. If I'm going to go damage strategy at the beginning and I'm being mindful, I'm going to go all out. I'm just going to be like, what actual physical number is here, you know?
Give me the card with the biggest number in the red circle.
Yeah, I'll tell you, sometimes I play games for fun where I'm just like, I'm going to pick the biggest number on each card on the field. Like, I'm not going to care about synergy, like sometimes. I'm just going to care about, like, what number is there, you know? And so sometimes I'll have like that, and then I'll have like Patrol Cutter, and then I'll have like some other ones that do lots of damage, and then that becomes my strategy. So when you're thinking about value damage, you have to think, are 2 cards going to synergize well just because of damage, or are they going to synergize because they have the same color? But like definitely you want to balance between those two. Is like are they going to synergize with damage with each other with the same color, or are their numbers just big enough that I can just combo all these cards together and then they're going to keep on giving me efficient damage, you know?
Yeah. Like damage is one of those things that, like, you don't need to ally everything in order for damage to be good.
Yeah, you don't.
You know, if you just bought a bunch of rainbow cards,
Blue, red,
but they
yellow.
all did 5 damage each, like that's still a pretty good deck. So like one of the things that comes up a lot in games that I have found is my opponent will buy a card that's like scary, and that like if I know he gets a couple of turns with it, I'm probably gonna lose. You know, a Brain World, a Nanobot Swarm, whatever. Like oh, if he gets 2 or 3 turns with that, I'm gonna lose. So very often what'll happen is, okay, I have to kill him. Like that's it. This is how we win. We win by just shooting him in the face and killing him before he becomes too efficient. Like once his deck becomes really efficient, we're dead, and there's no way we can come back. So the only chance that we have to win this game is to just blast him in the fucking face. And very, very often, and you'll notice this when I'm streaming, I'll just be playing. I'll be like, okay, I'll do this to counter this, and I'll buy this to try to get that, and then now I gotta kill him. Now that's it. It's done. So, Warkite, Ravager, Blob Alpha, all the blobs, get in my deck. Let's go. Because it's the only way we can win now. Like once he picks up Capital World, once he picks up Brain World, once he picks up, Imperial Fortress, just like
there's a new timer there. You know?
There's a new timer. Yeah. All of a sudden, it's like he's got to die in 4 turns or we lose. And damage lets you do that. Like damage puts the pressure on your opponent. It puts him on a clock. It forces him to to be defensive and to make tough decisions. Whereas you can make very simple, easy decisions. Buy the card with the most damage on it. It's not that hard, you know.
I mean, especially for a beginner, that's a good strategy, but that's a good mindset to start with. If you want to start with the most basic strategy, buy a bunch of damages, specifically blobs or yellows, or whatever, and just blast your opponent. Like, that's the most easy, most basic strategy we have, and that's the premise of the game. You gotta shoot your opponent in the face to win.
Yeah.
Like,
You need to kill them in order to win. If you don't kill them, you don't win.
yeah, there's a lot of games too. Is like where I didn't value damage enough, and then my opponent ended up just killing me. Because the game was specifically made where damage outweighs healing. And bases. Like the amount of damage they put in the game, that is more powerful, long run.
Yeah.
And in more games and more times that I've known.
So I'll tell you a little story about the first Star Realms tournament I ever won. It was live at this Berkeley card shop, and I was the great.
I was part of it.
Yeah, you were there too. The great Homer Jr., who is one of the best Star Realms players I've ever seen, showed up in person. Like, we met him live. Cool dude, really, really great guy. And I distinctly remember he, on the very first turn, would buy Frigate. And I'm like, that's weird. There's a trade pod out there. Why don't you buy trade pod? Why don't you get an Explorer? Why don't you get some more trade? Oh, there's a survey ship. No, he just buys the Frigate. And I'm like, okay. So on his second turn, he'd buy like a Blob Destroyer when he could have bought, a nice healing card or a nice trade card. And I was like, what's going on? Like, why is he doing that? So he would never have more than 8 trade in any of his decks. He'd pick up, something like a battle pod over, something like a Scrapper or a 4-cost Scrapper. And I was just like, this is so strange. I don't understand. But he kept winning because he realized damage realizes its potential faster than any other strategy. You buy a damage card, you put it into your discard pile. When you draw the damage card, it deals damage. Done. All you got to do is draw it, and it smacks you right in the face. Whereas, like, a trade card, you need to buy it, put it in your discard pile, draw it, play it, buy another card, then draw that card, then you start doing damage, right? Where a card like Battle Pod, all you got to do is draw it twice, and it's already dealt 8 to 12 damage to your opponent.
He's a fan of the quick. He's a fan of the quickie.
Oh, punch him now! Stop waiting around.
This is part of our romance and love of Star Realms special.
Really add it to it.
There's the quickie, and then there's the slow romantic foreplay.
Yeah. You know what? You don't need to walk along the beach and then get a kiss at the end. Just kiss it right away.
Just kiss it right away.
That's how you win at Star Realms. You win at Star Realms and in life. If you're in a boxing match, just punch him in the face right now.
Some games, some partners are going
to dance around and dodge and block and all this stuff. No, just do this. Just do this and you win.
The whole point of the game is knock him out.
Knock him out, exactly.
Some people might say, dance around like Muhammad Ali.
You don't need to be Muhammad Ali. You know why Muhammad Ali can do that? Because he was the best. You're not Muhammad Ali. Just punch your opponent in the face and win the fucking game.
He just punched people in the face more times than most people. So
exactly. Like Mike Tyson's saying was, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the nose.
Great strategy.
Plans go awry, and when they do, when your opponent gets those cards that make you go, oh shit, I might lose. You just gotta get some damage and kill them. Let's talk about weightless cards and why they're so good. And let's define what a weighted card and what a weightless card is.
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite stats that I actually.
You're the one that came up with this.
I'm the one who I actually did come up with this.
At least within our circle.
Within our circle, before everybody was into actual statistics or terminology, you can say, because I actually at that same tournament I actually had a sheet with me that had the relative number. I was keeping track of numbers. I don't know if I have that sheet anymore, but I had weightless, draw ability. I put all these categories of different concepts. So Now the thing about it, like if you were to talk about weighted cards are cards that don't draw. So they're basically they have an effect, and they basically bloat your deck. So they add like your deck bloatedness and your deck inefficiency, you know. And the reason why weighted cards are important because they might have effects that are really good for you, just for those moments. Now, weightless cards are cards that can draw, like Dreadnought, you know, like Mothership, like other cards that Command Ship. Like those cards are great because what they actually do is they add value to their deck because they don't bloat your deck. They actually keep it at the relative here. So a great strategy for people is to combine both weighted cards that scrap and weightless cards that draw, because that can create a very efficient deck. And next you're drawing 7, 8, 9 cards, and that's really the important of
You're drawing
versus
7, 8, or 9 really good cards,
exactly.
not just scouts.
Yeah, so that's really what the difference is. So what's your take on weightless cards? So we're talking about like all those cards that can draw, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, what is your take on that?
I would mention also cards like bases or cards that have ally to draw are also pretty darn good too, just because they have the potential to be weightless. So usually I if I think about like a scout is like a 1, meaning it takes a card draw and then I play it and that's it. And so it that's its value. Whereas a card like Dreadnought, for instance, is a 0, because you draw it, you play it, you draw another card. It's as if the card didn't exist in terms of like card draws that it takes to get through your deck. Whereas a card like a base, you put it out there, and then on the next turn, you're not drawing that base, and then your opponent has to kill it, and then later on you'll draw it again. But it doesn't come, you're not drawing it until the base gets destroyed. So it has value in that sense, and then you draw it back. So I think that's sort of half-weighted. Or a card like
Kind of like 0.5.
Yeah, like 0.5, like half-weighted. Or a card like Peacekeeper is like half-weighted, right?
So like yeah, so I came up with this stat, and I don't know if people want to popularize it again, but basically
As long as they credit Mr. Starball over here for it.
Weighted stat basically. So you would have like a cutter would be, you know, we touted cutter as one of the best cards in vanilla set for a long time, and nobody said that anything about its drawbacks until we started the weighted stat. And actually it has a weighted stat of 1. That means that it actually creates a bloated deck because it adds something to your, to the draw basically. Now a Peacekeeper, like you just put up there, would actually be a 0.5 because it's dependent on like whether you have a blue deck or not. And once you have that, it actually becomes a 0, because it actually
starts off as a 1, but with more blues potentially becomes a 0.
Yeah. So I would say every base, depending on its effect, most of them would be 0.5 because sometimes people don't kill those bases, And when you don't kill those bases, that actually acts like an extra draw, basically. It's actually even more better than a draw because you're actually using the effect twice.
Yeah.
Yeah. For example, like I would say game over, and you'll people agree with if you leave Rain World up for a second turn, like that effect is exponential. Like
you're done.
You are done. Like you just it basically takes away half your deck and it draws half your deck. Like that's the net potential. And the thing is with the weighted stat is that it varies. Like it's very dynamic during the game. So your deck, there's an overall deck weightedness, which is at the start of the game starts as 10, right? Because you have the 10, so of 8 scouts and 2 vipers. And then over the game, it's going to ebb and flow depending on what cards you get. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody wanted to take this on, wink, wink, as a scientific project. Like, how many games do people win that are more efficient? That means like they have a weighted deck a deck that is weighted less than their opponent, So I invite people on this podcast that are listening to this, if you want to take that on and start doing that with your games, seeing like what versus like, do people, my thing is this, do people with less weighted card decks win games more often, And so that would be an interesting test stat to really see, So that's card draws versus like, scrapped down, ability.
I can tell you this, Pat. I spent 100 games about a year ago doing that, and 72% of the time the deck with the lower weight number won the game. Like it's pretty incredible the correlation between deck efficiency and win percentage. It's pretty amazing.
So yeah, if you use those numbers, right?
And it's not even like, oh my god, like my deck was like a 7, so of course I won. Like that's not the point. It was like my opponent had like 17 and I had like 13, and I won because I was just that much more efficient than them. You know, yes, my deck is more bloated than it was when I first started, but it was still more efficient than my opponent's deck. And so the other thing that I found is when the discrepancy was like 6 or more cards, win percentage was like 90%, because they're just too inefficient to win the game, no matter what it was. Because once you get above 5, right? Because every turn you draw 5 cards. So if your if the number of your weight number and their weight number is at 6 or more, then that means you have an extra turn on them every time. You're gonna cycle faster than them by a whole turn every time. That's insurmountable. There is no way you come back from that unless you're just already almost dead.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty amazing.
And there's something that we can put in the intermediate, now that we're talking about this, that we can put in the intermediate podcast, which is what happens if they have that advantage, you know? Like, there are ways to win when you have.
How do you overcome that? Yeah.
Yeah, and my first thought on it, and we can discuss this more, is actually just draw so much damage. Just keep on picking up damage cards so that the deck inefficiency will actually just cancel out, you know?
Yeah.
So that's my thought and my theory on it, you know. So, but
you're hoping to kill them before their deck becomes efficient.
Or, you know, just keep on picking up cards until your deck just keeps cycling damage only, you know?
Yeah.
And then those 1 or 2 like scouts won't even be mattering anymore that come out, because you'll be drawing 3 or 4 like damage cards every time, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, because remember we were talking about how like scrapping bloats your deck initially, and then becomes efficient. So it's in that period when their deck is bloated, that's when you can strike and win the game. So their deck gets a little bloated, but let's say you buy a bunch of Falcons, or you know, a bunch of Burrowers and Blob Fighters, and you know, you have a lot of cards that just draw into other cards and do a little bit of damage. That might be enough, because then you're actually staying here at the 10, at your initial 10, and they're up here at like 13, 14. Eventually, they're going to dip below 10, but by that point, you might kill them.
You want to hit them at their soft candy core before, like, you know, before they get there.
There's a lot of grass in today's podcast.
before they turn into what is that Power Rangers like?
Zordon? Not Zordon.
Zordon.
Zordon's the dude.
No, what's the guy?
Megazord.
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 Into the Megazord, basically.
Yeah, you gotta kill them while they're just Power Rangers.
Damn those Rangers. Really my pledge again.
Damn you Power Rangers.
The
world. I live in garbage, man.
But along that stat, I wanted to also talk about like there's draw. I mean, there's also like a draw stat. There's like a scrapping a scrap stat that I created also.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like the number of card scrappers you have in your deck versus your opponent, and then there's also the number of draw cards you have versus your opponent, you know, too. Like that's also another like worthy stat, that, because sometimes you're like, okay, if you have 10 cards that draw, that's like having a second deck, you know.
Yeah.
With your deck, you know. And if you have scrap, like, and that sometimes, you know, if you have like I would say the best decks have a great combination of both scrappers and draws, because you can actually negate all the inefficiencies that initial deck has by having draw cards, you know. Because you know, so there's definitely those like stats that people can get into. So yeah, I think it's just great.
No, you're absolutely right. Because like, and this is why weightless cards are so good, is you're not making your deck any thicker than it initially was. So you're gonna draw into your best cards faster, and you get the effect that's on the card that draws. Because there's no, you know, every draw card has some sort of additional effect to it. And that's what really makes them good. It's like getting a free effect.
Yeah.
You know, being able to draw 7 cards is better. You know, being able to play 7 cards is much better than being able to play 5 cards.
Yeah.
Plain
So
and
like a takeaway for a beginner, when you're thinking about all this, because this can be kind of like a lot to think about, is like like what are the amount of scrap cards that my opponent has versus me, and then how many draw cards does my opponent have versus me, like you generally want to have one or the other, versus your opponent, like an advantage. If you have both, then you might win the game more times than not,
you have both, you should win. Yeah.
So you have to know, in the terms of mindfulness at the beginning, is where am I at here? My opponent has lots of scrap cards. Oh my god, what do I do? My opponent has a lot of draw cards, or he has both. Like, what do I do? Like, what do I do? You have to be able to flow with the game. This is why it's important to not play solitaire. You have to really focus on what the opponent has, because these values matter. Like the advantages your opponent has versus you, that's what you have to think about to be a successful player.
Absolutely. Yeah. And realizing like, okay, I've lost the scrap edge. There's no way I can get it back. Well, I'm going to win in damage now. Or
I'm going to win
losing in damage.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Or I'm losing in scrap. Maybe I can get card draw, and that will make my deck just as efficient as his, and then I can win with damage. Or he's getting scrapped down. Maybe I can get a bunch of bases and negate his scrap edge. He's getting scrapped down. Maybe I get a bunch of discards and force him to discard, and now he's discarding really good cards, and his efficiency doesn't matter anymore. So, like, there's plenty of ways to beat every different way of playing the game, but having the mindfulness and the awareness of being able to say, my opponent is beating me here, how can I beat that? Or my opponent is beating me here, I'll focus on something else.
Like, yeah, and just to add, like, yeah, scrap. You pointed that out. Like, if my opponent has a scrap down efficient deck, there is a way to beat that, and that is discards. Basically, you have 5 cards you draw every turn. I'm gonna discard 3 of them every turn. Like,
Yeah. So now your deck sucks.
Now your deck sucks. Your efficient deck sucks. Unless
Yeah.
you have all the draws. But like it's.
Now you're only doing like 8 damage a turn, and I can
out damage you easily.
Defend that, so.
Like,
yeah.
So there's strategies to everything. This is a game
There's
that's why we love it, because it's not just one thing beats another. There's multiple things that can beat multiple things.
Guys, thank you so much for listening and watching the Dreadcutter podcast.
Thank you for scrapping your way through our podcast. We really appreciate you spending our time just chilling with our geekiness over here.
Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.